I'll tell you a very quick story though while we're waiting to see my slides. It's going to be quick because I have to do a really quick 50 years. 50 years this year I'm celebrating in the business. But my journey into dyslexia started as a child because I was the fifth of 6 kids, and my older brother, Jim, really struggled with reading. And of course, we didn't know why. My parents really tried to help him, but nothing really seemed to work. And I'm happy to say that he's done fine in life, but that's because he had very supportive family. But I always, it impressed me how difficult it was for him to read. And I learned to read pretty easily. I taught my little sister to read, believe it or not. We played school in our basement. After school every day, I went to kindergarten. She was so sad that I left. She'd come home every day and I'd teach her everything I learned. And I went to a Catholic school where the nuns didn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. This was 1956 when I was a kindergartner. And that was at the height of Dick and Jane. Dick and Jane basically taught you to read by memorizing words. We now know that is not the right way to teach kids to read, and we've learned a ton since then. But today's talk is really to let you know that this is a field that continues to evolve. And every year that I spend in this field, I learn more and more. I question even, am I on the right track? Because there are differences. The researchers don't agree, which frustrates the heck out of me. But all that to say, I feel like this has just been an incredible journey for me. This is not just a professional journey, it's a personal journey. Because not only is my brother dyslexic, I married a guy who didn't know he was dyslexic, but he is very, very dyslexic. And yet he's thrived as well. We have 3 kids, one of whom, of course, is dyslexic. But I'm going to talk about dyslexia and today, because dyslexia is rarely alone. It's rarely one thing. It is almost always comorbid is the term we use, or co-occurring with other things, and I'll talk about that, and how that complicates identification and treatment. But at the same time, we have so many advances in the field that we have to keep. I'm a positive person. I keep thinking about the advances too. Of course, I also have grandchildren now. Guess what? 2 out of 3 grandchildren are dyslexic. The little one, who's 5, the jury's still out on her, because you don't identify dyslexia until a child is reading, right? You identify risk, and that's a very important distinction, right? We can't identify dyslexia until a child has actually been in a reading program, right? And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I taught Reese, my oldest, who's now 10, to read during the pandemic on Zoom. She's got attention deficit. It was not easy, but I used wonderful decodable books. I used Jamboard, Smartboard. I used all the tricks. I don't know how I learned those tricks at my age, but I did. You learned how to use a virtual platform to teach Reese to read. She was a willing student. She was amazing. So much fun to work with. But, just because I taught her to decode, which is what I did, doesn't mean that she was good to go, as I'm going to talk about that too. There's so much more, but that decoding is a really important first step. Then Tate came along, and of course Tate's dyslexic too, and she struggled actually even more because of other issues, which, again, this is personal and professional because I live this every day in schools, as well as, personally with my family. So I started Literacy How in 2009. It's a nonprofit organization. We're based in Trumbull. I have a team of 10 mentors. We call ourselves mentors. We really are coaches. We're external coaches. We go into teachers' classrooms and we demonstrate best methods of reading instruction. We work pre-K all the way up into high school. And I actually have been working with a school that's here today. So we've worked in public schools, in private schools, and every experience is different. Every single experience is different. But what's the same is that we're building relationships with teachers to inspire them to continually learn what they need to know in order to provide optimum instruction for their students. And it's all through relationship building. And of course, I have an incredibly knowledgeable team. I will not talk too much about policy because that will get us off track. But the policy that's in place right now that has really been problematic on some levels is the right to read legislation requiring districts to choose a core reading program. I'm sort of agnostic when it comes to reading programs. Why? It's the teacher that makes the difference. The teacher who knows a lot, the teacher who has a ton of experience, and you can, as a great, experienced, knowledgeable teacher, you can take a mediocre program and teach a kid, right? You can have the best program in the world, and there is no perfect program, right? And that's why I'm a little agnostic, because we have a menu of programs to choose from. Teachers need materials without a doubt. They should not be spending their hard-earned money on teachers pay teachers downloading lessons. And that's what they do often when they're not given materials to teach. So yes, the teacher is the key variable, but you can have a great program and not know what to do with it. And these programs are what we call bloated, right? Meaning they're jam-packed with stuff, and many teachers will say, I don't know what to do, I don't know what to use, I have too many things. We need to continue to provide the support for teachers to do the very best thing, and that's obviously a very common theme. That's my shtick on that. I'm now going to talk about dyslexia, and I'm going to start by posing this question: is dyslexia real? Right? Because there are people in this field who say it's not real, right? The dyslexia paradox, the dyslexia myth. It is real. There is a genetic component, we know that. There is evidence of language-related differences that are present well before reading instruction begins. Nadine Gabb, right, at Mass General, Boston Children's Hospital, has done phenomenal research with babies whose brain signature is different, right? So we know these kids are born this way. It's not a developmental delay. Students will not get better due to maturation. Intervention is required. So here's my outline. I know I don't have a lot of time, but I'm going to try to get through as much as I can. This is a QR code. Please take a picture of this. It will take you to a Google Doc that has live links. So where you see, can you see my cursor right here? Yep. Where you see this little icon on a slide, it means that I'm pointing you to a link on that resource list. So the resource list includes some of my favorite websites, resources, infographics. There's so much out there. So take a look at that. I was so blessed not only to be in the family that I was born into, but also I went to a program at the University of Connecticut in the master's program, and I studied with Isabel Liberman and Don Shankweiler, two renowned researchers in the field of dyslexia. And in 1965, they began to study children learning to read, and these were their aims, what they hoped to do, what they hoped to learn about at the time. At the same time, whole language was coming on the scene. What we now call balanced literacy was called whole language, substantively the same thing. Reading should be as natural as speech was one of the tenets or myths of whole language. When reading is difficult, it's because teachers make it so, because they're trying to get kids to decode. That was absolutely persona non gratis. You did not teach phonics at all. It was basically, what's the word I want? Banned. I was out in the field for 25 years, teaching kids predominantly, and then I came back to Connecticut And at that point in time, there was a research to practice position open at Haskins Laboratories in New Haven, and I was so fortunate to be able to get into that position. And I worked with researchers there. It was a phenomenal experience because I interfaced with the people that were doing the research, and I would question and challenge and say, why can't you do a study that shows what it looks like with real kids in classrooms? Because the science of reading was too basic and esoteric, in my humble opinion at the time. But at the same time, Connecticut has been a front runner in policy, and you can see some of the policies and some of the funding that we received while I was at Haskins. And at the bottom of this slide, I say, acronyms abound in education. It bugs the heck out of me. SBRR, SRBI, RTI, MTSS, like, those are words, and people throw them around like you're supposed to know what they are. By the way, I made a little faux pas. I always start by asking my audience, right, who you are, so I'm going to do that really quick. Raise your hand if you're here as a parent primarily. You're here as a parent, right? Raise your hand if you're the parent of a young child, like pre-K to 5, let's say, okay? Raise your hand if you're a parent of a middle high school student. Oh. Did I forget something? Oh, middle school is 6th grade through high school. Pre-K through 5th grade, I meant to say, so sorry. Pre-K through 5th grade, sorry. My brain is going too fast. Pre-K through 5th grade, that's what we refer to as pre and early elementary. And 6th through 12th, because that's another, right? That's a different animal, right? Once kids leave 5th grade and go into middle and high school, we're talking whole different scenario. How about teachers? Do I have educators here? So some of you wear 2 hats, I know, right? Great, it's so nice to have educators here. What about higher ed? I know I've got Kristen here, and Katie, and Judy, like, great. And do I have any administrators? School district administrators. I know Stephanie is back there. Just one? Oh, I wish I had more administrators here. Over there, great. Because the administrators are making the decisions, and we need more of them in these conversations, for sure. Teachers have very little power. I wish they had more. Okay, so the science of reading. What is it, right? The science of reading, what some people call SOAR. It drives me nuts because you say SOAR, and I don't know what you're talking about. You say SERBI, which is basically SRBI, RTI. You got to spell it out, especially for parents. Don't use those acronyms around parents. It frustrates the heck out of them. But science of reading, what it is and what it is not. The National Center on Improving Literacy is a phenomenal organization. Unfortunately, when I went to check my links yesterday, they didn't work. Actually, Heather, thank you, Heather and Christina. Raise your hand, they're here from Literacy How. Thank you for checking those links. The website is down now for some reason. It will be back, but it's a really great organization. The Reading League is still here. The Reading League, there's a defining movement guide. If you really want to go deep into the science of reading and learn a lot more about it, it's a great guide that's very user-friendly, and you can download the PDF. So you see that link, that takes you to that guide. So the science of reading is really a body of knowledge, right? That's what it is. It is not stagnant. It is not a manual. It is not what you teach or how you teach. It's the research that should be informing what we teach and how we teach, and it's ever evolving. The science of learning to read and reading instruction and identification has been around for 60 years, 60, and yet it has still not gotten into the hands of many people that it needs to. So that's why I'm on this bandwagon. So forgive me if I get very passionate about this. It's really important. The science of reading is also very much about teaching us about the reading brain, because the reading brain is a phenomenal thing, right? It has to develop a circuitry in order for kids to become skilled readers. We're not born with the wiring. We are born to speak, but not to read. So each new reader, as Marianne Wolf's quote says, comes to reading with a fresh brain. And you can see Stanislas Dehaene, a French cognitive neuroscientist who has studied the brain, and this is just a picture of it. And what it shows us is that you have to develop all these circuitry networks. We have to connect the areas of the brain that are there for speech and language, but again, not for skilled reading. So what about the brain and dyslexia? As I mentioned, it's genetic. Dyslexia is neurobiological learning disabilities. We're born with these brain differences. But the good news is the brain is plastic, meaning it can change. And it can change into adulthood, right? It's preferable, Judy would tell you, to get this job done in the early years, right? But if you don't get the support you need when you're 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, you can rewire the brain later. And what happens is when you learn to read fluently, the brain actually rewires. Now, there are lots of risk factors for dyslexia, and Tim Odegaard, who's a professor at Middle Tennessee State University, one of the links that you have, one of the best links is the Tennessee Center for Dyslexia. It's on that sheet that I gave you. And this is what Tim has to say about it. Rather than a single cognitive profile that fits all students with dyslexia, multiple differing profiles have been linked. So that's the take-home message. Many different learning profiles. Multiple risk factors, right, work in conjunction to create the probability and increase the probability of difficulties. And the risk can be moderated. And this is really important for parents to understand this, and ultimately for kids to understand, that the risk can be moderated by positive influences that serve as what we call protective or promotive factors to counteract the risk factors. And this comes from Katz and Petcher's article on this very topic. So you can see some of the risk factors here. By the way, I will send my slides to someone, and I'll send the slides to PDF of the slides so you can have them for future reference. But you can see in the category of risk factors, we have the phonological factors, which I'll speak a little bit about, trauma, attention, and then what are the resilience factors, right? Good instruction is the number one, a growth mindset, task-focused behavior, family and peer support. All of those things matter and will counteract the risks that dyslexia brings with it. Jack Fletcher's been in the field of dyslexia for many years. His colleague, Misiak, wrote a really great infographic for National Center on Improving Literacy. Like I said, sorry it's not there. It will be back. But it basically references all these different definitions, right? There's one for the DSM-5, there's one from the American Academy of Pediatrics, and then there's a definition that was adopted now more than 20 years ago by the International Dyslexia Association, written by Reed Lyon and the Shawitzes. And it's been widely recognized since then, and this is the definition. In the interest of time, I'm not reading slides. I will give you these slides. You can find this definition very easily. But it just recognizes the fact that dyslexia has to do with reading, right? With word reading and fluency. It also impacts spelling. Most of the time that occurs because of a phonological deficit. What does that mean? Phonological is sounds. People with a phonological core deficit difficulty have trouble not hearing words. It's not an acuity problem. It's processing the sounds within words. It's hard to hear them as separate, because if I say the word health, and I'll use this in an example in my breakout session. If I say the word health, everybody say health, right? Health. It's hard to hear health, right? They're all folded together. It's called co-articulation, when those sounds are spoken so quickly in running speech that you can't take them apart easily. And yet that is a really important, who knew, indicator that a student would have difficulty learning to read, and that came from Isabel Liberman's research years ago. And then there are secondary consequences, right? Because if you're not reading, you're not growing your knowledge, you're not growing your vocabulary, you're not practicing the heavy lifting, the important work of school, which is to learn, right, through reading. And that's not happening if you're struggling to lift the words off the page. Again, I want to give you hope, because there is hope. There's this thing called neurocognitive flexibility that I just alluded to. Devin Kearns is another researcher in the field that's done a lot of great work on dyslexia and talks about the fact that we can change the activation patterns in the brain. This is an old slide that's been around for 20 years, but this has been replicated. The left two slides are, it says the left hemisphere, right hemisphere, right? We see a kindergarten student, and it's not one student, this is many brains. This is how the technology works. You can see very little activation in the left hemisphere in kindergarten. Because these kids had a very good intervention for a period of time, that those areas of the brain lit up in the left hemisphere that are indicators that you're building this circuitry, that you're building the wiring that you need to be a skilled reader. Now this is really important though. Learning to read takes time, and it's hard to read this slide, but the bottom line is this. English is one of the most challenging languages to learn, if not the most challenging language to learn. And the reason is that we've adopted words from other languages. We have Greek words, we have Latin words, we have our Anglo-Saxon words, and because of it, we have what is referred to as a deep orthography. Say the word orthography. Orthography. Very fancy way of saying our writing system or how we spell words. Because of all those influences and the etymology, right, where these words came from, it's going to mean that the words are spelled differently. You can teach kids this stuff, and I'll talk about that later in my breakout session, but we just have to acknowledge, teachers have to say to kids, yes, it's a hard language, but it's logical. It's not random. It's logical, and I am going to teach you about that. I'm going to show you how these languages have influenced our words and get kids excited about that. Now, this is Hollis Scarborough's rope. How many of you have seen this rope? Oh, look, a lot of you have. Well, you're going to see it again later, but basically what this rope shows us is that reading is the product of two very different things. At the bottom of the rope, you see word recognition, right? So you have to be able to read those words instantly, but you also have to understand what you're reading. So those are two incredibly different things, but they contribute equally, right? So they're highly correlated. Without both in place, you're not going to be a skilled reading comprehender. And based on that simple view of reading, we have this table that shows 4 different profiles. Now, this comes from Louise Spear-Swerling's work. Louise is at Southern Connecticut for many years. She's amazing. And this is actually, you're going to see a link to this too, because if you have a child who's been identified as dyslexic or having one of these profiles, this is what the State Department of Ed now uses to describe the profiles, which is a huge step in the right direction for our State Department. One size doesn't fit all. So basically, based on the simple view, we have 3 profiles. We have the kids who are dyslexic with word recognition difficulties. So you see them in the top left box, right? Good word recognition, below average word recognition, but good language comprehension. Then you have the kids who have language comprehension difficulties, right? And if you look at them on this box, you'll see them in the bottom right-hand box, right? That means they can read words just fine. Their comprehension is a problem. And then you have kids that have problems with both, right? And they're called mixed reading difficulty, right? And they need both word recognition work and comprehension work. I hope this is helpful because we have to know which kids need what, right? So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about dyslexia, sort of separate from the comorbidities, and I want to just show you another great link is to school-based identification of characteristics of dyslexia. It's a parent overview on the Reading Rockets website. What it does is it really talks about assessment. And assessment is super important. I have no time to get into it in detail today. But the bottom line is we have to start with screeners. We have to know right away, and we know we have great screeners. We even know in pre-K, but let's say for sake of argument, at least in K, we know right away which kids are at risk. It doesn't mean we identify dyslexia. We have to do an in-depth analysis to identify dyslexia. But we know which kids are at risk, and when we know that, we start to change the instruction to match their needs. And we collect what's called diagnostic data. We go a little deeper. We find out why they had trouble hearing the sounds and the words, and we do a phonics inventory, and we do more in-depth phonemic awareness understanding about the kids. And then part 3, progress monitoring. That is hugely important because if your kid's identified, don't just figure, okay, we're good, we figured out what's wrong. No, we have to keep taking data. We have to keep seeing, is the student making progress? Because I hear this all the time. Parents say, my kid's been in the same intervention for 6 months and he's not making any progress. Unacceptable. You have to change within 6 to 8 weeks if you don't see progress. And the only way you're going to do that is if you get the progress monitoring data. And it's for teachers who haven't learned how to do that, it feels arduous. It feels like, oh my God, when do I teach? I've got to teach these kids. Well, you can assess and teach. If you know what you're doing, you can diagnostically watch a kid responding to instruction and go, oh, I got to go back and reteach that. Or, oh, they already know this. I'm going to go to the next step. So the assessment's really important. This document that's listed here, oopsie, is it coming back, hopefully? Has it been like this for a while? Oh, good, okay. It will come back, I hope. Anyway, this link is really a great one for if you need to know more. Where is Josh? Let me see, maybe my, All right, well, while you go find Josh, thank you, Kristen, I'm going to keep talking. One of the problems with identifying kids with dyslexia is we have a wait to fail model, right? You all, those of you who have been in the trenches, it's terrible, right? Well, we can't identify dyslexia because they haven't been in instruction long enough. No, we have to identify it as quickly as possible. And this dyslexia paradox is that we often wait till 3rd, 4th, 5th grade. And that's, I don't want to say it's too late because it's never too late, but it's later than it should be. Let's put it that way. What? And it's harder than it needs to be, precisely. So we don't want to wait. Now, sorry that we don't have the slides up. I don't know what happened. Technology. I love it. No, I don't. So we have in the state dyslexia legislation. It's a dyslexia assessment of sorts. It's not a specific dyslexia assessment. Some states actually do have a screener for dyslexia. We don't, but what we do have are assessments that could indicate that there's a problem, like it includes a rapid naming piece. Okay, so it will, if teachers know how to do this. What happened?
I have no idea.
Oh, come on, Josh. Look at that. I bet it's going to come right up.
Sometimes when I touch things,
See, it was my fault probably. I talk with my hands too much.
glitch in the matrix.
All right, thank you. So this is the slide I was talking about. This is in statute. So we do have, and if you've been told we don't screen for dyslexia, you can just reference this legislation. We should be doing the screening. We should have screeners that identify that. Treatment of dyslexia, I'm going to run out of time, so I won't be able to get into too much on this, but I mean, I'm going to talk about treatment for sure. But what this slide is that says, Linda Siegel, a magic pill would make the learning disability disappear. Wouldn't we all like that, right? The treatment road is littered with charlatans who promise the world and merely empty the pockets of unsuspecting consumers. I see parents shaking their heads because as a parent, you're desperate. You will do whatever you can to help your child, and often you do get sucked in to things that have no evidence behind them. So you really have to do your homework. You really have to go to trusted sources to find out if it's real. And then Margaret Bird Rawson, who is, in the field way longer than I was, passed away a number of years ago, talked about the fact that the treatment is educational. The understanding is scientific, and that's important for us to know. Because dyslexia is not a medical diagnosis, even though it's in the DSM-5. It is really, from my way of thinking, must be an educational diagnosis. And what we teach our teachers, and what I want you all to walk away with, is understanding, where does language fit in? Because dyslexia is a language-based learning disabilities. What does that mean? It means it affects language, right? And it means that when you have your little 2-year-old showing signs that there's a problem, you need to pay attention to that. And when you go to the pediatrician, and 90% of the time they'll tell you, don't worry, right? Worry. If you're worried as a parent, you have good reason to be worried. You have in your gut, there's something not right. You're paying attention, and that's what you should be doing. And you should be pushing when somebody's saying, don't worry. Because language is the biggest indicator, right? Kids who present with difficulties learning language, articulation difficulties, all those things, because if you look at this slide, it shows these 4 language systems that are inextricably linked. You have listening, right, which is receptive, speaking, which is expressive, reading, which is the written language, which is also receptive, and speaking, or writing is expressive. So these 4 language systems, and I really like to explain how you have to teach the writing system, right, that goes along with what the writing system is to teach kids to read. In an alphabetic language, for example, kids need to know the code. This is a link, which I'm not going to unpack this because, again, I'm going to run out of time. But this link is to the Right to Read project that Margaret Goldberg started a few years ago. And this is an infographic. It's a phenomenal place to read provocative information about reading and challenges that schools face, that parents face, et cetera. You'll find a lot of interesting things. But this infographic caught my attention because it shows the reading strategies that kids have been immersed in, by and large, in our country, including our state of Connecticut. And there are still districts in our state that are teaching 3Qing. They're doing it behind closed doors. They're doing it because they philosophically believe in it. This is not a philosophical thing. There is science. No child should be guessing words. No child. It is a very hard habit to break. And it happens because sometimes the tier 1 teacher, general ed teacher, is still doing the leveled books, and then that child goes off to the resource room and is being taught to decode. And they're like, what? I'm confused. What am I supposed to do? No, these things should not be happening. As I mentioned, dyslexia by and large impacts word reading ability, and I've talked about this, so I'm not going to go through it. But there are some important points made on this slide. When you get the slides, you can read about them. But it's basically explaining this phonological processing problem, which I like to show this picture because takes something that's complex and breaks it down a little bit. So phonological processing includes being able to remember, right, what you're hearing, what you're reading, etc. That's called phonological or working memory. It requires phonological awareness, because I have to hear the sounds to be able to read and spell. And then it requires something called naming speed. I have to be able to retrieve the name of something immediately to become a skilled reader. And if I'm slow at that, it's going to take longer. Now, some of you have students and children who have slow processing speed. What does that mean? It means they're going to be slow readers. And you have to be patient, but you have to give them lots of practice so that they develop the automaticity. This is our reading wheel that shows the components of reading. And so now I want to really talk about what we call structured literacy, because that's the instruction. How many of you heard the term structured literacy? Most of you have. Structured literacy has been around for a long time. As this quote says, although the term was coined in 2019 by IDA, the roots can be traced back to Webster, who wrote the dictionary many years ago, who was very interested in spelling and orthography. Orton, Samuel Orton, Orton Gillingham, and other advocates of systematic methods for teaching our English writing or spelling system. It's really, and I love the end of this quote, such structured approaches contrast with progressive education beliefs that learning should be natural, unstructured, and internally motivated. That's fine for kids who learn to read easily. Guess what percentage of kids learn to read really easily? 5 to 10%. That's it. The other 80, 90% need good, explicit, direct instruction. Again, you'll get a link to this. I know you can't see it. This has got tons of information in it, but this is the infographic that IDA put forth to show the what is structured literacy, the content of it, and the how. How do we teach it? It's pedagogy, right? So just thinking about the two aspects of structured literacy, which are really equally important. And these are some of the important things about balanced literacy that we're trying to stop, for lack of a better word, because balanced literacy wasn't teaching explicitly. There wasn't a specific scope and sequence. There wasn't the diagnostic assessments that needed to be, administered to kids. All these things are part of a balanced literacy approach. Kids are reading independently. Do you know how many kids we watch reading independently in classrooms and they're not reading because they can't read? What a waste of time that is. We don't have that many instructional hours in the day, right? So when drop everything and read makes me nuts. Because most of the kids who would benefit from reading independently are not able to, right? Okay, never mind. You know how I feel now. This is just a slide about the importance of spelling. I want to just say a couple things about spelling, because spelling is still taught, unfortunately, as a separate subject, right? We're going to study about habitats, and so we're going to learn these 10 wonderful words about animals' habitats, 10 wonderful vocabulary words that the kids cannot spell. They couldn't spell them to begin with. They might try to remember them for the test at the end of the week, but they forget them 2 days later if they learned them in the first place. Spelling should be taught reciprocally with reading, right? They go hand in glove. And this is an important point, and I don't think I mentioned this book, Unraveling Dyslexia, which I just read. It's on your sheet. I love this book. It's a little dense, but it's written for parents and educators. It really helps explain the complexity of this topic. And this slide just talks about the fact that if you can't spell well, you don't feel good about writing. It will impact your writing with 100%. So even though people say, well, why are you bothering to teach these kids to spell? They're never going to be good spellers. That is absolutely true. But they'll get close enough that they'll try, and their spelling will improve with instruction. So it's not a waste of time by any means. Another thing I want to talk about dyslexia is the reading fluency issue that I mentioned earlier, right? Is that kids with dyslexia, by and large, don't read fast, right? They don't read automatically. They're error prone. They trip over the words. You're like, how could you not know that word? Like, that is a basic word. It's the little words that trip them up. They drop them. They put another word in its place. It's close enough. But no, they have to read every single word accurately, right? Every word matters. And so we do have to think about the automaticity part of reading fluency. And Marianne Wolf has talked a lot about that. If you have trouble with naming speed, it affects word calling, like retrieval of anything, not just the words. It can be retrieval of, what did I have for dinner last night? Or what do I call that thing that I use to write with, simple words. So we really have to think about the automaticity because reading fluency obviously is necessary for kids to be able to get to the best possible place academically. If you're tripping over words, you can't make meaning, right? The cognitive energy that is required for kids to decode when they're not good at it takes their energy away from the heavy lifting, which is making meaning. Now, I want to also talk about this, which I mentioned briefly, but I want to say this again. It's really important, is that in order to identify dyslexia, we have to document that the student is not responding to good instruction, right? And that's number one. It has to be good instruction to begin with. If they're not responding to bad instruction, well, that's probably part of the problem. It's not good instruction. But if it's good instruction and they're not responding, we have to have documentation. That's why the progress monitoring is so important. Okay, can I have 5 more minutes since we started late? I'm already over. Yes. 5 more minutes? Okay, great. Because I want to talk about comorbidity, and I'm going to talk more about this in my breakout session. But secondary consequences. Obviously, kids face academic challenges, also non-academic challenges that I listed here. And something that has come up in the last year. How many of you have heard of developmental language disorder? Okay, great. Great that many of you have heard of this, because this is a term that's not new, but it's becoming more and more in the forefront of our minds because we see more and more kids that have dyslexia and developmental language disorder. So remember I showed you this table? So instead of it being identified as specific reading comprehension, where you're good at reading words, but your comprehension is suffering, we're now calling this developmental language disorder. And developmental language disorder is, as I said before, when kids have trouble with speaking, with understanding language. They learn language, but they're delayed in using it and understanding it. Again, these differences are also noted in the brain, so it's neurological in origin. But look at the last bullet point. 30 to 50% of children with dyslexia also have developmental language disorder. That's a huge number, and it's relatively undiagnosed. We do not have screeners for this, so please take some time. If you suspect that your child might have an undiagnosed developmental language disorder, perusing these websites, I've linked you here. This is a great infographic, but this DLD and Me, Tiffany Hogan's work at Mass General is phenomenal, really, really phenomenal. So the quote just talking about the fact that we are not identifying these kids because we're not measuring language in schools. Why? Because it's hard. It's way easier to find kids who are at risk for word reading difficulties. It's very hard to find these kids because we don't have the tools. We're working on it. Another comorbidity with dyslexia is dysgraphia. And I gave you a link to a fact sheet from IDA. It's not just impaired handwriting. It usually goes hand in glove with impaired spelling. Okay, and here's a definition of dysgraphia. It can occur at any age, and it has to be identified because we have to give specific intervention, instructional methods for helping kids who are dysgraphic. One more comorbidity before we end is ADHD. Obviously, Smart Kids has amazing information, and fairly recently published, well, February 3rd actually, ADHD, the young adult years. So, so much we need to know, so much more we need to know about attention deficit, because so many of our kids are undiagnosed with attention. We could speculate that some of that is coming from the world that we live in. I believe that's part of the problem. Whoops. I think my mic, oh, there it is. But either way, we have to understand what the implications are. And ADHD is often, it goes along with executive function. They're not the exact same thing, but there's a lot of overlap there. So some of you have heard of executive function difficulties. Other co-occurring challenges, which Dr. Tim Odegaard, who I mentioned earlier, is the editor of Annals of Dyslexia, and Annals of Dyslexia is an IDA publication, but last year they came out with a whole issue devoted to the definition of dyslexia, which is where I got some of my information for today. And what I really wanted to point out here is he's on a bandwagon to really talk about the mental health as a secondary consequence. And that is very, very, very important for us as parents and educators to find kids who are struggling not only with the academic challenges of being dyslexic, but also the secondary consequences that come along with it. For some, not all. We still need to know so much. Really, for me, I feel like I've spent my life trying to learn and understand more, but there's still so much more to learn. Optimum instruction is obviously, for my way of thinking, one of the most important things, because we can start it early, and if we start it early, we can continue to keep kids motivated to learn and be their best selves. So in closing, I just want to read this call to action. This moral imperative, the opportunity to learn from previous failed attempts to improve reading instruction, combined with underutilized scientific knowledge, offers hope that the reading wars can end and literacy rates can improve, but this will happen only if we carefully think through how to seize the current opportunity. We have an opportunity now. The science of reading is being talked about, is being written about. Let's keep that momentum going so that we can impact kids' lives in the way that we all want to do. Thank you.